Thank you, everyone, for being here so early on Saturday morning on your days off. We have an exciting and powerful day ahead of us. Last night, we were given an incredible masterclass by Jeff Howe on community engagement and essentially a how-to manual to organize for real change. I know that I will be referencing this material for many years, and I'm so grateful that we had the opportunity to host Jeff's last lecture in North America before he moves to Singapore. It's a great honor. The seeds that Jeff has planted over the course of his life's work have already grown into many fine oaks. It means so much to us that you're here and ready to do the challenging work of dismantling structures that harm both people and the planet, as today we are faced with such wicked problems. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the sacrifices and the synchronicities that have brought us all together in a confluence of knowledge and fresh ideas. Many of you have traveled a long way to be here, and you are away from family and community and your important work. Thank you so much for taking the time. It means so much to us. We are so excited to welcome Matthew Wizinsky, Associate Professor of Practice in Urban Technology at Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Matthew Wizinsky is a designer, an educator, a researcher, an author, and a parent. Matthew has over 20 years of professional design experience. He has curated, organized, and designed exhibitions at art institutes and museums. His interdisciplinary collaborations have included work with researchers in architecture, social sciences, digital humanities, and public health. Matthew's first book, Design After Capitalism, was published by the MIT Press in 2022. The book diagnoses challenges for design practices and blends design entrepreneurship with social empowerment. The Hopes team was so drawn to Matthew's critical examination of capitalism and his passionate dedication to the work. I especially appreciate how accessible Matthew makes theory. In addition to writing his book, Matthew created study guides to accompany it. And furthermore, he created a series of memes that break down theory into simple, understandable chunks that are accessible to everyone. Matthew's work provides models that educate designers on how to dismantle complex, multidimensional power structures and reinterpret the role of the designer to effect systems-level change. We are so excited to have you here with us, Matthew. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for taking the time to join us here in Lawrence Hall at the University of Oregon. Everyone, please welcome Matthew Wizinsky.
Thank you. Great, thank you, Elise. Thank you, everybody. That was a very dramatic build-up, so I'll try to follow that up well. Yeah, it's a real honor to be here today. Thank you so much to the organizing team for the invitation, to all of you here at the University of Oregon, everybody who's watching online. I have spoken at a lot of conferences and a lot of universities, but I think this is the first one that's been a fully student-organized enterprise that also has been running for a very long time. So it's a very special and cool thing, and you should all be very proud of what you've got here. So yes, my name is Matthew Wizinsky, and the presentation today is titled Design After Capitalism, and as the sort of funky typography on the title slide indicates, I'm going to try to talk about a couple of different kinds of design on this topic. But I first wanted to start with a story. It takes place here. You may know this place. We might still call it home for a little while. And I don't really quite know when the story starts, but I'll sort of pick up the story in the late 1960s in a place called the United States. And most of you probably know this was a time of great social, cultural, and political upheaval. Effectively, a lot of people, particularly a lot of young people, were kind of combating, rejecting, and vocalizing resistance to a lot of the systems that we might call the status quo at the time. There was a civil rights movement that was effective in its organization. There was a feminist movement. There was a very animated anti-war movement, most animated by students and young people. And in January of 1969, there was a massive oil spill off the coast of California, which caught some attention, some popular media attention, but really caught the attention of a senator from Wisconsin named Gaylord Nelson, who had been trying to help people notice in his home state the way that industrial production was doing damage to the natural environment. And Nelson recognized and was so inspired by particularly student involvement in the anti-war movement that he saw this opportunity to really galvanize these multiple intersecting issues around ecology, social concerns, political concerns, cultural concerns, et cetera. So he started working with a young activist named Dennis Hayes, and they decided they would do a teach-in at multiple universities across the country. They decided a really good day for this would be right between spring break and final exams to get maximum student participation. And if you haven't guessed already, they decided to call it Earth Day in 1970. And in its first iteration, millions and millions of people participated in different kinds of events to try to bring together and in some ways connect the dots between these ecological and social concerns. And I think what's so fascinating to me, and the reason I'm telling this story today, is that I looked at the calendar when I got this invitation and found out that, maybe not by coincidence, Earth Day is on Monday, the 54th edition. And I think the resonance goes beyond this kind of coincidence of time, or maybe it's not a coincidence of time, which is that here we are again, I think, with a lot of different kinds of social, political, cultural, economic, ecological issues. And I think what we're doing in part is kind of fusing them with the fervor and the ambition of a lot of young people who are also demanding that we all do better for the future. So I am a designer. The kind of designer I am changes sometimes. My first degree said graphic design. My first job title was interaction designer, and there's been a bunch of other titles in the middle. But I think what that means in part is that sort of my historical moment of becoming a designer was in this transition from the ways in which particular skills and competencies of making printed matter and material and informational media were starting to be translated into how we do those kinds of things with making and designing digital matter. And I guess fortunately for me, I was kind of at this transition point where I was able to begin working in both. And I think in some ways because of that, most of the work that I was doing as a professional designer and continue to do has, in my mind, has something to do with making worlds, making little narrative worlds that people can enter into. As I moved kind of from a practicing designer more into an academic space, doing research and working with students in a lot of different ways, I discovered how useful it was to be a designer working on interdisciplinary projects in the ways that designers might aid the processes of doing interdisciplinary research work, but also aid in making outputs that publics could make use of and understand. And so projects like the images that are above that are work from a group of activists as well as social scientists doing research around barriers to equity for women of color in Cincinnati, translated into a collection of publications, a traveling exhibition, listening stations, so that this combination of activist work and academic research could then be recirculating into the places where these stories came from. A project that was a commission from the symphony orchestra to create a kind of animated, playful space in the city, making effectively a public plaza into a musical instrument by jumping and dancing and playing in space, depth tracking cameras and these kinds of things. But I think significantly to me, just a reminder that the city is not just a place of rational control, but also a place of play and surprise and chance and serendipity. And more recently, I had to include, of course, like the one somewhat landscape architecture project in here, a project, a collaboration with my friend Sean Lally, imagining a landscape intervention that also paired climate data with a kind of augmented reality experience to think about the really long registers of time that exist in any one place. And in doing these kinds of projects, again, I think the contribution of what were, I would call, professional design skills has been useful in working with different fields and with different kinds of communities. And Jeff Howe's presentation yesterday was really inspirational and resonated a lot with these experiences. And so as one example, a long-running collaboration with someone who's become a dear friend, Dr. Jennifer Breyer, who's the director of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois Chicago, and I kind of built this collaboration called History Moves. We were asking how might design processes, but also design outputs help in doing the work of making public histories. How could we design experiences and interactions with language and images that would allow people to tell their personal narratives in a way that would then allow them to craft them into collective narratives, pairing them with archival imagery to turn kind of the personal into the collective. One of the projects that I'm most proud of was a project titled I'm Still Surviving, a living women's history of HIV in the United States. And in this project, we were working with 40 different women who are HIV survivors living and thriving with HIV in Brooklyn, Chicago, and a pretty wide radius around the Raleigh-Durham area in North Carolina. And doing what I just described in ways that kind of fold back into some of these design capacities, like bookmaking. So we've made exhibitions, we've made films, we've made digital stuff, but few people experience co-authoring and co-designing a book. And in that process, the participants could sit around the table and collectively weave their narratives, their personal artifacts, archival imagery into something that could then be output as a public-facing public history, not just of these women's lives, but a different view, in this case of the city of Chicago, through the lens of HIV. Similar but different, a project called Southside Speculations, in which design was brought in to help shape public narratives about the future. And in this case, I'm working again with historians, my collaborator, public historians, but also researchers in cinema and media studies, filmmakers, an Afrofuturist filmmaker, local historians, and 23 adolescents from a variety of specific neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago, neighborhoods that very much were designed for segregation, designed and became the outputs of structural violence in various ways, and inviting through design processes and design methods these young people to imagine and then tell us the future of their neighborhoods they'd like to see. So design helping tell future narratives at the scale of a neighborhood. And it looks a lot like design studios I've taught in universities in many different places, but here the young people are engaging in different techniques for storytelling, rapid prototyping to create props that can animate the narratives that they're crafting, and then eventually working with the filmmakers to create what turned into a variety of short speculative fiction films focused on each of the different neighborhoods that they live in and were representing. And what should probably not come as such a surprise is that in many of the cases, the kinds of artifacts, the way that artifacts were designed, what they were for, how technology was deployed, looks quite different from what you might expect from kind of the techno-utopian view of what technology is for from large technology companies. And in this particular case, David and Asha's project was imagining augmented reality as a way to engage in both histories of struggle and histories of police violence in their neighborhood, while also being used as a tool to work towards reconciliation and community justice. So I'm telling some of these stories as kind of a setup. I mean, this is the kind of work that I had been doing, and through this work, I think it helped me understand something that I think also Jeff was talking about yesterday in his own words, which is this distinction between a kind of expert design and diffuse design. And I'm using here the language of the design theorist Ezio Manzini. Some of us study design in universities. Some of us study it over and over and over again in universities like myself. Some of us write books about it. But also everybody performs design. Everybody designs in the ways that they turn existing situations into preferred ones through courses of action that may be material, they may be experiential, etc. And the point isn't just to say that these two are different. That's important, I think, to acknowledge this difference, but also to say that expert design can be very useful in facilitating diffuse design. And so my shorthand for the presentation is capital D, little d for these two. Okay, so this is a little bit of an introduction, but back to my timeline. 2016 was a strange year, also in this country, and there were some things of consequence happening politically, and certainly it seemed to me that kind of the space of political discourse had shifted in a variety of directions. And of course I was paying attention to this and concerned about this and paying attention to polling and things like this. And when doing that, something really stood out to me that was very unexpected, and maybe I was just totally naive or whatever, out of touch or something like that. But in some of the polling about sort of political views, I came across this in spring 2016. It came from the Harvard's Kennedy School Institute of Politics, and amidst a lot of questions about political perceptions around the election that year, there was this question which was asking young people, 18 to 29 years old, in the US to identify with certain categories. And what jumped out to me was partly how few of the respondents in this age category aligned themselves with one of two political economic ideas, socialism and capitalism, 16%, 19%. But I think even more striking to me, it's a little hard to read in the graph there, is that 51% claim that they refuse capitalism or refute it. And again, I might have been out of touch, but I was like, wow, that is, I did not recognize that this is not some variety of perhaps fringe sentiments. This is actually the mainstream political view of young people in this country. And of course, as a parent and also as an educator, I thought, these are my students, these are my children, this is the world in which these young people are the future, and they are, in a sense, without allegiance to, I think, one of the major structures underlying our society. And so, I mean, with this, I think two things jumped out. One was just this recognition that this is the mainstream political view, but I think maybe even worse, there's no coherent view of an alternative, that this 20th century binary is like the limit of our political imagination. I find that very sad. And so to continue, this kind of polling has continued many times, both in the US and UK, and the numbers sort of keep shifting in predictable directions, but there is still this like nagging question, but what? If neither of these two, then what? And coming across this kind of polling and sort of paying attention to this and wondering about this massive, I'd say, cultural, social question did remind me of the words of Frederik Pollak, who was a Dutch sociologist and one of the founding figures of future studies. And Pollak describes quite succinctly that the rise and fall of images of the future precedes and accompanies the rise and fall of cultures. When we stop to have a shared aspiration of what our future looks like, our culture doesn't last very long. This is scary, I think, on a number of levels, and I would sort of add to it then the ways in which our political economy may be tied to ecological crisis and or social crisis. Now we can add cultural crisis to the polycrisis of our moment. So I guess to pivot here, I believe that we are living in transitional times, whether we'd like to or not. And unfortunately, I don't believe that we have a clear, coherent, or at least generally shared image of a preferred future. And I guess to this question, which is a bit overwhelming, a sort of small, maybe quiet, humble question, which is, can design help? Is there something here that design can do? So, of course, after reading all that and thinking these things, I started a course that for the first time I put these three words together, design after capitalism. I was very fortunate to teach this studio course for several years to undergraduate and graduate students in fields like communication design, fashion design, industrial design, and had many brilliant, young, very ambitious and critical students coming through this course over the years. And what we were trying to address was, can design and design practice and design output in some way help us to envision life after capitalism? Of course, there's that famous Frederick Jameson quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. I don't think he's far off. It was really, really hard, right? It was really hard. It was amazing to me, even having framed the question, how difficult it was for us even to I think our way past our kind of conceptions of what design should be in terms of producing generally goods and services for a market economy. And so, the follow-up question then would be, could design, if we could start to get a glimpse of some versions of life after capitalism, we could try to create some kind of image of the future, what would design be like in that other future? What kinds of projects, what kinds of designing, what kinds of designers would be there. And as you can see, the students worked on a lot of really strange and wonderful things. Asking questions like, well, could we make furniture out of garbage? Could we make clothing that would help us evade surveillance? Could we, what about toys? Like, what toys do we give our children to play with so that they'll have a certain sense of their political or social place in the world? Could we build sort of small-scale, interactive systems for local exchange, like sort of eschewing like the grand market economy, but bringing it down to like a small-scale exchange network? Lots of questions about how design and technology make different kinds of ways of living, ways of doing, ways of working come to be, and questioning the ways in which those things might become commodified and extractive in various ways. Okay, so I did that for a while and then wrote this book, same title, that came out in 2022, as was mentioned. And I think really the most important question to me was this: how can we begin to think beyond these logics and subjectivities? And these are very specific words I'm using that I'll talk a little bit about. I'm asking this question from the perspective of, I guess, capital D, professional design. And the point of the first question is to get to the second question so that we might begin to labor, to work, to act, and to live in different livelihoods. And this language is also very specific in referencing the political philosophy of Hannah Arendt. And I think what I was trying to do, like in writing form, was kind of think out loud with my students and maybe other students and other people, something that I certainly did not have really clear answers to, but was really imagining that there might be some inroads here. And I think I was also doing what Hannah Arendt puts best, which is proposing something that I thought was very simple, which is just to try to think what we are doing. What are we doing as design practitioners in the 21st century? And the reason that I felt like we needed to think this differently is that most of the design fields I mentioned largely became professionalized, largely developed their methods and capabilities in an era of industrial capitalist mass production, and have changed with the times. But I don't know that we really have a clear understanding of what it means, or a very clear, articulate idea of what it means to be meeting needs or creating value in the kind of networked digital economy that now operates in the logics of a time when ostensibly free and abundant information is everywhere and valuable, and yet logics of property and ownership have shifted so that platforms can both set pricing and control and make rules around how information flows. These are the spaces where designers are doing some of the most financially and economically valuable work and making outputs that are actually quite different from, let's say, chairs and garments and things like that in the form of, brands and experiences. You could ask a designer what these things mean, and they might have an answer, but these are fairly nebulous categories of work, I would say. And yes, this is SpongeBob from one of the memes, so if the the long version of the book is whatever, please do enjoy the memes. Also, this issue of subjectivities, what does it mean to become, to be a subject of this system as a designer in an economy that values sort of cultural, informational, communication-based products and services. This kind of valorization of the hustle culture, which is, I think, really ripe. I'm probably in architecture as well, but with design students, like this idea, like really valorizing that I am going to, be a part of this hustle culture. I think to the extent that every individual designer, and this probably applies to other fields as well, imagines themselves as this very atomized unit of the economy. Every one of us is a little economic function in direct hyper competition with each other. Thus, we become brands. And you can even go so far as to hire your personal branding coach or your personality coach to help you elucidate what your personal brand is. Now, listen, I understand, we all have to operate under these kinds of circumstances, but I assure you, you are not a brand. I assure you, you are more than a brand. And so I find this kind of subjectivity a bit alarming. Part of this experience, both in practice and education and sort of being involved in these fields, I think also hinges on what I consider two substantial turns in the way this kind of design as practice. I mean, the first one I touched on quite a bit is like this non-material or dematerialization of design outputs, and I think, I don't know, who knows where it starts, but like, in the making of software, in the production of user experiences, in UX design, in the making of services, in the making of brands, sort of the outputs or the objects of this kind of design have become increasingly experiential and social. And I think this is significant. The second one is this kind of generalized problem solving that has become kind of the calling card of design practices, and is alive in discourse around design thinking, innovation, design strategy, and also sees designers of certain kinds operating in spaces in really new ways, like social innovation, healthcare, government, finance, and not making the logos and packaging and stuff like that, but actually like considering how healthcare services are crafted, how governments connect and receive and communicate services with their constituents. And two words that became a red flag almost all the time in practice were these two, particularly in this order. The idea of an exit strategy, which is saying out loud that the project does not really aim for some long-term, stable, equitable, sustainable outcome, but a way out. And at the micro scale, this is sort of alarming, but I actually think what might be worse is the way that this kind of logic seems to be at the very root of our largest scale, technologically inspired images of the future, that we are crafting our exit strategy. And, I mean, all the sort of, laughter and groans aside about like, oh, let's go colonize Mars. I think there's also something like just dangerous about the fundamental idea behind a lot of these projects, which is that it's like this is the inevitable end stage of where we're going. This is the dominant image, so it's like just get on board. And I actually think Jeff's presentation yesterday was a great articulation of, well, actually, the way that things come about, the way that the future comes about is through discourse, is through some kind of engagement, through, working through political processes that are not going to be just, my way or the highway kind of thing. And I think this presupposes that, maybe we should just get out of the way or something. Okay, so what have I actually learned that I can share with you? I wish I could say a lot more than this, but I will just share like a couple of examples, because part of this project has been trying to find little bits of what I might call alternative economic theory or bits of thinking that might be able to be brought into design practices in a way that make them practicable. And I'll just share two. One of them is this notion of community economies, particularly as it's articulated by the feminist economic geographers J.K. Gibson and Graham, who two people who wrote under one pseudonym, and also the conception of human needs and satisfiers from the Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef. I know there's at least one economist in the crowd, so I can would love to talk more about that. So first of all, it's like what does it even mean for us to think the economy? Like, what is this kind of conception? I know this is not something we typically have talked a lot about in, at least in my experience, in design education. And I think one of the most important things that J.K. Gibson and Graham have taught me is that when we are thinking like the economy, we are doing so with a lot of blinders and a lot of assumptions in front of us. This is a very well-known and oft-cited image that I'll share with you, probably some of you know it, called the tip of the iceberg. And what J.K. Gibson and Graham are saying is that often when we think about the economy, we think about this. We think about, well, I go to work and I provide labor for a firm to make goods and services that they will then sell in a competitive marketplace and take the revenue from the sale of goods and services to pay me my wages, to pay for materials, to maybe invest in expanding the enterprise, probably pay some shareholders, maybe some stock buybacks, and then I will take my wages and I will go buy products and services in a competitive marketplace, thus circulating value, and profit accumulates in different directions. Okay, these are the basic contours of capitalist enterprise, and they're saying yes. I mean, this is how this piece works. But no matter where you look, there is this vast plurality of economic functions and forms going on. You just have to look. that anywhere you go, no matter where you go, you will find a vast plurality of ways in which value and exchange are crafted, and an even more diverse range of forms of these kinds of exchange and value creation. And so on the one hand, it's like the dirty little secret is like, hey, the economy doesn't really exist. It's always this vast diversity and plurality of value creation and exchange, et cetera. And so if I've done nothing else, hopefully it's taking the capital D professional designers and saying, and students and saying, like, let's just look below the waterline and see what design might support. What are the different ways in which we might have some role to play here? It's already happening. Let's find ways to work with it. I suspect, not everyone's a designer, right? So I suspect this also could be said for many other professional fields or fields of expertise as well. So what does it actually look like? So what J.K. Gibson Graham had done, where they were studying different areas of the world that were, I'm going to air quote here, like economically depressed, and looking at economic development as generally considering how the injection of resources, particularly money, might create, new flows, new markets, et cetera. And they said that in this work, we often really overlook the assets that are already there, that we're not really looking below the waterline often to find out that maybe the models of economic exchange are there and ready to be tapped into, but just aren't being aren't given ample attention. And so they give a lot of different examples from places all over the world, a variety of forms of economic exchange. I've tried to simplify this somewhat, and also to come up with some examples that I can then share with designers that I'm working with. So in these columns, we have different forms of transactions, different forms of labor, different forms of enterprise, and try to find case studies and examples that are relevant or that I can explain and understand in some way, sometimes ones that are very close to home. Just to give one example, the top left category is about local trading systems and alternative currencies. Wow, sounds like crazy fringe stuff, right? Like, where does that actually happen? Well, the little example there of the green currency, this was actually an outcome or something that happened during COVID in a little town called Tenino, Washington. I don't really know where it is, but maybe not too far from here. And so in Tenino, Washington, when COVID came along and there were all these lockdowns, a lot of concern about small businesses being able to survive, the city decided to start printing a local currency. And to do this, they went to City Hall and I imagine dragged out this big printing press and dusted it off, because the last time they used that, it was to print a local currency about 100 years ago. And so these ideas were already there, the infrastructure was already there, and suddenly the circumstances changed, and such a thing doesn't seem quite so fringe anymore. I've had the opportunity to take this thinking to some unexpected places. So in sort of crafting this, what I call the matrix of community economies, I think this in and of itself is the idea. It's a bit of a framework, but how do you actually inject it into different kinds of design practices? And noting that the kinds of design practices I'm describing are quite diverse. But for example, I was invited to come talk about these topics at Google, which is kind of a surprising place to talk about post-capitalism. But at the same time, Google has quite a few people working there who show their concern about what the organization is doing, even this week. And the conversation was really around how to use this kind of thinking in the process of doing UX design for something like search. And if somebody is looking for something that seems to be what in, I think, the default mode would have commercial intent, how might UX design actually bubble up and help us identify those opportunities below the waterline? How could a search actually find ways that we might tap into alternative forms of transaction or labor or enterprise? Probably not too surprising. I should back up. The US government and different state and municipal levels of government, but particularly at the federal level, have increasingly brought service design into part of what they do. There's a professional working group called Service Designers in Government. Most of these folks are working for very large federal agencies in the United States. A very cool dude, Victor Udawea from NASA, invited me to bring in a workshop, and in this case try to stitch this kind of tool or this kind of thinking into the service design process, which is somewhat different from UX. And in that case, it's probably not surprising that the federal government of the United States also has a kind of capitalist logic to it. And so if the federal government or federal agencies are providing services to those in need, one of the ways that they might do that is hand out money. And that goes pretty quickly into a profit center. So we talked a lot about the SNAP system in an inflationary period, what's happening with this situation, and could we inject into the service design process ways of thinking about these local economic forms so that the money is not just ever so briefly in the hands of someone in need, and then sort of straight back into profit centers, but spends a little bit more time circulating within communities. The other thing that I think has been very helpful for me as a kind of a thinking tool in design practice has been kind of recalibrating my thinking about needs. And we talk about needs and unmet needs, and design research even to find unmet needs quite a bit in discourses I've been a part of. And I think what was really inspiring was coming across the work of Manfred Max Neef, who is a Chilean economist, and largely his conceptualization of needs comes from what he describes as like a long legacy of failed attempts at economic development in Latin America, because of similar things to what J.K. Gibson Graham were talking about, that the idea is effectively if we can create markets in these places, then they will become developed economically, but it almost never really works well for the people who are becoming markets. And so what Max Neef says in no uncertain terms is that fundamental human needs are finite, very few, and classifiable. They are the same everywhere, for every person, for every culture, and every historical period. What changes is what you do in order to satisfy those needs that are common to everybody. Now, I cannot verify this for every person, ever, anywhere, ever, of course. I can't verify that. But what I think is so important is that Max Neef draws our attention not to the stuff, but to the practices of satisfaction. That this can take almost any form. And for his sort of finite list, these are the 9. I think even maybe more interestingly, one of them is subsistence, which is the only one that I think demands some kind of material satisfaction. We need food, we need water, we need energy, we need shelter, and these kinds of things. But the other 8 are effectively social and or psychological. They may be satisfied by certain material forms or artifacts or spaces or environments. But what Max Neef wants us to understand is that the more that these things are synergistically satisfied, the more that we're hitting on multiple needs simultaneously, and the more that those needs are sort of connected to other things and other forms of satisfaction that are happening locally, the more flourishing a community, and the more flourishing of I wouldn't call it economy, but the more flourishing a society will be. And so Max Neef really, for me, completely flips the other dominant needs framework that we may know from Maslow, which in this case is it's not a hierarchy, it is an ecology. They're all relational, they're all needs, and if we over-satisfy some, it will be at the cost of others. And if we are only what he would call exogenously satisfying them from way outside whatever context we're talking about, then there's going to be some deterioration of some of these other needs. Okay. So what do you do with that, right? So what I've been working on with this conception is, I love a good matrix, another matrix, matrix of satisfaction, in which case we can take this conception of needs and put them sort of on one axis as a kind of tool, and also inspired a lot by the work of cosmopolitan localism, in this case the work of Gideon Kossoff, describing that there are these distinct domains of everyday life where this need satisfaction happens. And if we can think about what we're actually doing as designers in the sense of satisfying needs, if we think about satisfying needs in this kind of way, then this should help us to think about the things that we're creating and what they're for. And if they are for satisfying certain kinds of needs, then we are giving shape to that satisfaction rather than giving shape to commodities or this kind of thing. And so what it looks like when doing this with designers or design students is pretty quickly looking at the ways in which different kinds of need satisfaction are happening and the ways in which those are connected to different scales, is that the artifacts become less the focus. They are there to support new kinds of social practices, the ways in which people are doing things differently in domestic spaces, in city spaces, and bioregional spaces, and neighborhood spaces is really the activating factor of the kind of need satisfaction being described. We use this as an analytical tool to look at things that exist throughout in the world, and we also use it as a generative tool for projects that the students are working on. So I think in this case, the student was assessing earth ships and how, like, the making of earth ships in the New Mexico desert as a kind of a case study of using the Max Nefian framework. But when we make projects, I think it also changes what those things look like. I mentioned I'm not an architect, but for some reason the University of Michigan let me teach an architecture course last semester, and we use this framework to kind of repeatedly look at need satisfaction as a justification or an explanation for what we were doing and how we were doing it. And the projects took some pretty interesting forms, I think. Christina Barra was already very interested in what she called guerrilla gardening or flower bombing. She would make these little seed pods and kind of put them in, like next to the parking lot or next to the apartment building just to beautify her environment where she went. And sort of thought about scaling this up, but still through, like small social networks. So making a map of the city where we might consider rain gardens to mitigate surface flooding, where we might consider pollinator gardens for biodiversity, and basically making it a map of basically Google Maps where here's where I put my pod, here's where you should put your pod, and people are sort of building up a kind of landscape of the city in this way. Zoe DeBia was really interested in biomaterials, but was like having a hard time getting started because it's hard to think about like putting them into a building form. So starting small, making toys, making building blocks for children, making compostable Legos. Who doesn't love Lego, right? Compostable Legos. And I think there's a really fascinating sort of long-term thought here, which is like the child has compostable Legos to build structures. The architecture student has compostable material to make models, and this kind of material familiarity becomes just part of the sort of the long-term goal of someone who will one day make larger structures and has, from the start, been manipulating compostable materials. And I think this project at the bottom by Sophie was really fascinating. She called it Femzo Mari, a feminist update, I guess, of the work of the Italian designer Enzo Mari, who in the 1970s had a well-known project called Autoprogettazione, effectively instructions for people to construct and build their own furniture, their own sort of domestic stuff, and making the point that this is better than consumerism for a number of reasons, but also people have like a direct hand in making their material environment. Based on a variety of personal experiences, Sophie was interested in thinking about this through the lens of ethnic and immigrant communities in which women may not have access to the official labor force for a variety of reasons, and may want to create various forms of care services in their home. And so building the structures and the furniture and these kinds of things for things like building a home beauty salon, nail care services, these kinds of things. And so there's like an element of care services also crafted into the sort of making it of your own. And I just love when she's like showing all of her classmates, like, and this is how you build it with the power drill that you haven't used before. And I think really significant to this work is that it doesn't stay in the classroom, it has to go to diffuse design. So everyone has to make these instructions and test making them as legible and usable as possible to people who are not kind of in the privileged confines of the architecture studio. So I said at the beginning that we are living in transitional times, which I believe to be true, again, whether we like it or not. But how do we design for transitions? And what does that question mean? I think that question means how do we begin to understand that we are not designing for some end state, but constant change, that we are putting things into flows, into circulation, into motion, and it doesn't really stop. But also that transitions happen and you can't really always control them, so how do we imagine that we might design towards directing transitions in particular ways? How do we seed the direction of transitions towards, not some end state, but towards a direction? I think this is kind of the big question of an emerging field called transition design. Folks have been talking about transition design a bit over the last few decades. Carnegie Mellon, to my understanding, started the first program with this particular name, the first doctoral program with this particular name. I feel very fortunate to be in that program as a student right now, so this is heavy on my mind, but this is some of the language and some of the framing on a very top level of transition design from Terry Irwin and Gideon Kossoff, two people I've been also fortunate to work very closely with in this program. And what they're indicating is to do this work, it's too big, it's too vast, the timelines are too long. You cannot be doing all of these different things. Finding some area of knowledge and skill sets and finding ways to relate that to other areas of knowledge and skill set, recognizing that design has some role in this, but it's not a very big one, so one must be radically collaborative to do this work. And also just getting comfortable with the fact that you're working on projects that you will last longer than your lifetime. And so that's a different framing of thinking about a sort of short-term problem solution kind of dynamic that I feel is much more common to my design education. And so thinking about this, I've been struck by something else recently, which is, has anybody read this great book, The Ministry for the Future? Kim Stanley Robinson? Yeah, I mean, like, okay, so I've been struck by this emergent literary genre and sort of aesthetic movement called solar punk. I think on one level, the sort of circulation of images of solar punk has been useful in that it can give us a kind of cultural imaginary that words may have a hard time describing. I have heard people call it utopian, I think in a negative way. I'm not saying utopian's a bad thing, I'm just saying that some people call it that, although to my understanding, most of the solar punk literature I've come across is very clear about trade-offs and the painful realities of making transitions towards positive futures. But what I think is so exciting or sort of inspiring is that this sort of, I'd say first literary and then aesthetic genre comes up at a time when the world was probably looking very dystopian to young people who were crafting these ideas. And I should be careful just to say that I think solar punk is fascinating to me in some ways because it contains or sort of foregrounds a set of values without necessarily closing them off to the possibilities of what they could become. So the notions of ecology, social justice, collaboration, anarchism, or if that's too scary of a word, local control, and the idea that technology takes different forms in these kinds of futures. And so having looked into this and having somewhat studied sort of the background of this and talked to some of the folks who were kind of propagating solar punk as an idea, starting in London about a dozen or so years ago, started asking well, okay, if this is a possible and or preferable future, what would design look like? Again, back to this question, what kinds of things would be considered the designing of everyday life? And to try to understand that question, trying to put together a little bit what is useful from some contribution of solar punk to a kind of future imaginary, and then where can we connect that to existing knowledge around what I would call the building of ecological technologies. We actually know a lot of things that we could be doing really differently in small to medium to even fairly large scale aspects of our everyday life. So plenty of instruction books out there for how to get a group of friends together over a week and build a wind turbine, and yet fairly uncommon to actually do that. So some of the questions here have to do with how might design participate in making how to do this more accessible, more usable, and in doing so, how might it actually make it more motivating? Or sometimes I say this, I'll probably get in trouble. It's can we just make it really cool? If design can make plastic and metal cool, can we make building wind turbines really cool? And so to try to experiment with this idea, I started something, I don't know what it is yet exactly, but it's been called the Solar Punk Design Academy. And essentially it's been a variety of public workshops where we will do things like talk about alternative economics, read a little bit of solar punk, and then make biochar. So we make pieces of cuts of ductwork and tin cans, and we'll make a top-loading updraft stove, which if you use it just right will create a carbon sequestration process called pyrolysis, and is effectively doing decarbonization. It makes fire, which makes heat, so you cook a meal and you talk about what you're doing, and then you also have biochar and talk about, now, what do we do with biochar? Doing DIY hydroponics, where you can't really complete the project in a day, So you get started, and then you have to rely on this community of practice, these other people that showed up to finish your project. You have to probably share the nutrients to put in the water, figure out how to clean the algae, like share the harvests or whatever. And I've been really so heartened by the way that these workshops, which were public-facing, sort of anybody could come, but really have become truly intergenerational in ways that I probably didn't expect. Still working on it. So I'm working towards this dissertation, which is titled Design and Post-Capitalist Desire. I've got about one more year, so probably more succinct things to say about it in a short amount of time. I wanted to end with some concluding remarks, but I didn't think that was actually possible either. So I'm going to leave with a series of statements about things that I feel like that I'm still working on, and maybe it's a process of, again, thinking out loud about some of these things. So, it's really hard to picture different livelihoods. It is really hard to picture the future, I think, really for anybody. I'd say few people can really articulate a version of the future, a vision of the future that hasn't been to some degree already manufactured for them. And so this is one way that I think design can help, but again, this is like a tiny contribution to what that work looks like, and have to be really, I think, radically collaborative to do that. To design for transitions generally, but I would say in particular the kinds that I'm describing, really does require attending, I think, very pointedly to the different social practices and social relations that you're creating. It's really, again, it's not about the stuff. It's really about the practices and what that can animate. And I think this is, part of the sort of transition of thinking about design that probably many of us are experiencing. And again, that I think expert design can support diffuse design. So experts can help the diffusion of folks designing and creating courses of action to preferred situations in their own lives. It can do this in various ways: building capacity, creating open forms of knowledge and tools, facilitating opportunities to collaborate. But again, I think it comes down to this, which is that everybody designs, so maybe we could help them. And probably the most exciting one, which is that the future, as much as I've talked about it in these last 45 minutes, doesn't exist, or at least the one future doesn't exist. That it's always a space of radical possibility, and we're all inventing it right now. So what a privilege. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, wow. I'm totally inarticulate now, so I'm going to let everybody else ask all the questions. And I'd like to start with my friend Sarita here, who I've invited to ask questions of Matthew because Sarita always inspires me to ask questions.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was incredible. You answered a lot of my questions. So now I'm scrambling a little bit, but I think I want to ask you to go a little more in depth, if possible, around the discussion of objects and information. And just a little bit more about developing new value structures around that. I feel like that is definitely a way that we can begin to shift our perspective, shift our expectations, and sort of begin to build those futures.
Okay. So the question was about information, objects, and value structures. So let's see. I'll start by this. I talk a little bit, like in the book, I talk a little bit about the work of Mackenzie Wark, which has been another kind of useful thinking tool. Wark, I would say, kind of a transdisciplinary theorist who works in design spaces and teaches at Parsons. And Wark describes this emergence of a new class structure in the contemporary economy, describing where there might have been sort of the working class and the capitalist class in ages gone, that we have what Wark describes as the vectoral class. Who controls the flows of information in an economy where information and data is very valuable? And those that control those flows of information, Wark identifies as the vectoral class because they control the vectors, right? And we could say this is, the sort of platform economy. I think that's one part of it, but there's probably a lot more nuance we could go into there. Wark then describes the hacker class, which I think would be the class that most creative professionals would find themselves in, which is basically like hacking novel forms out of whatever existing bits of information and culture that we have already available to us. And it's that sort of hacking of novelty that is, it's like it's both sides of the coin in my mind. It's sort of like that hacking of novelty out of all the existing information for the purposes of the vectorial class is maybe part of the problem, whereas it's also right there. It's also available. Sometimes it feels like it's so available. Why is it not common practice, for example, to just go build a damn wind turbine? I should be clear, I have not built a wind turbine yet, but I'm really trying to find my crew. So I think that's part of it. So it's about, I think, like maybe less about in that case, if we're to take it further, I think where your question is going is like not so much about where is the value capture currently, but if I would go to kind of the Max Neef perspective, it's like what needs is this satisfying? What needs is information satisfying, for example? What needs are tied to or attached to certain kinds of objects, and what kinds of satisfaction come out of that? And so in some cases, I think it could be that the information, like the open source knowledge, plus some, I don't know, motivational kick to make use of it, some opportunity or some awareness to make use of it, could be part of it. On the flip side, it's like we also do, I guess, sort of, we operate in this situation where we got to pay the rent, and we still have to, we still have to produce sort of financial value or come up with financial value at the end of the month in various ways. So I feel like there's some of this sort of competing of these two really different paradigms that are completely enmeshed. There's he was a financial journalist turned author named Paul Mason who wrote, I thought, a really interesting book called Post-Capitalism. And I'll paraphrase a little bit, but his quote that I have used sometimes talks about this being kind of the emphasis of the struggle of kind of a dying and emerging system. Is like on the one hand, we have sort of property and sort of the closure of systems. On the other hand, we have open source, all these other kinds of things. And we are kind of living through the struggle of those two things interacting.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Okay, all right, let's go over here.
Thanks, Matt. That was fantastic, and I really appreciate all the sort of theoretical perspectives you bring to this, and given your clear focus and study on this and the dissertation you're working on, I have a question. It's not directly about this, but I'm curious. I'd love to know your thought on the role of the internet and design after capitalism, because I think it entered our world with a perspective that it was going to sort of open up a lot of possibilities, and from some perspectives, it's done just the opposite.
Yes.
So I'd just be really interested to hear your thought on that.
Yeah.
And if there's anything as designers that we could do about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And for sure that's that tracks very much with the personal timeline that I'm describing, sort of entering and in my early career working in what felt like this wide open, like anything's possible. Wow, we can like tap in, like share anything around the world, and design could create any kind of experience inside this digital space. And it was incredible for a while until it wasn't. And part of what wasn't was just the increasing, commodification of those spaces to the point where, design became effectively templatized. And it was pretty easy to imagine, like, I bet I know what the website for this place looks like, because I bet it's the same template for the place that, and it's not sort of like just what it looks like, but it's like that we had built into it, had commodified into it, I guess, these kinds of patterns. But I think what you're also describing is the ways in which, a system, a mindset and a system that is like very good at kind of enclosing things to cut off access in order to then make them commodities, which is kind of the original, kind of one of the origins of capitalism itself, like enclosing common areas of pasture and grazing and things like that, happens in a lot of our spaces. And I think that this is really, and I don't have a good answer for this, like how do you actually avoid that? How do you design against that kind of, the potential for that kind of enclosure? In some ways, open source projects and certain open source models have done that. Someone who's a big inspiration in some of this work, a guy named Eric Olin Wright, sociologist, describes, he'll talk about Wikipedia all the time. Is like, put the 200-year business of encyclopedias right out of business just by having people, make Wikipedia. That kind of system requires new social practices, new kinds of labor, like new sets of rules for how people sort of participate in that. I think that yeah, the internet is yes, a big part of it, yes, big part of the problem in terms of where we've landed, and the opportunities to remake it in some way or reuse it in some way. I think also have to be really attentive to like lessons from this kind of enclosure and commodification. I think probably some folks know the work of Cory Doctorow, who's written a lot about all kinds of interesting things, and Cory describes the enshittification of platforms to describe very specifically, like, here's this cool new service that you're gonna really, really love and it's free. Great, we're all gonna use it. Okay, now you have to pay for it. And it's like, and then it goes the other way. Oh, you should come advertise in here. We got all these people over here. And it's like, okay, we're gonna make it really shitty for you too. So like basically everybody starts to lose. And I think that that also with the way that design practices that generally have come to be known as user experience design have really entered into this space where the proposition is really unclear, I think. If you're working as a UX designer in many circumstances, it's like, I'm trying to get these people to do this, but the actual goal is this, right? And it's like a bunch of clicky over here makes a bunch of ad revenue over here. Who cares what happens in the middle in some cases? And so this is a really, this is a really curious dynamic to find oneself in. I think also probably difficult to think through in those practical circumstances.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Matthew. That was really awesome. It got me thinking. Yesterday, I was actually in I just had a chat with this teacher about skill building. I teach middle school students, and it's hard sometimes. He was using an example of elementary school students and how you break down skills into step-by-step concepts in a sort of hierarchy of learning. So you start with like sharing, the idea of letting somebody use something while you're not using it, and then slightly up from that, like letting it leave your table, and then up from that, letting somebody use something that is very close to you that maybe they won't give back for a while, and then up to like giving away something that you love, and just sort of the skills are on this hierarchy. And it made me think of the wind turbine, because I would be intimidated by the idea of building a wind turbine. So how could you break that down to make it more accessible sort of in that hierarchy? And I'm thinking like you could have a workshop on it, but then you have to get there. You have to get to that workshop. So how do you make it even easier from there? You could take it to a neighborhood and like do it in a park right next to where people live or something. What are your thoughts on that, on breaking things down into accessibility steps in order to like make the DIY more accessible? Yeah,
it's a great question. I actually, as part of the PhD research, I did one particular focus study that was looking at, I sort of took a sample of DIY instructions for various, what I would call ecological technologies of different kinds, also looking at different like models of instruction. So from TikTok videos to, like WikiHow or something like that, and also scaling up from like, a hydroponic tower to a wind turbine. And it was really fascinating to see that there was this kind of like complexity curve that emerged. Like sometimes things that looked too simple, that looked simple in the instructions felt too simple, and people felt sort of deceived by it in a way. And then of course on the other end, things were like, this is just too complicated, I can't get into it. But I think what you're describing is a kind of scaffolding up of those kinds of skills. So yes, I mean, I haven't done it, so I don't know, but it seems like that would be possible. It seems like that would require, a pretty significant commitment from a number of actors to make that happen. But I guess adjacent to the question, I also think something that I stumbled into learning through doing some of these workshops was that, it's the Solarpunk Design Academy is kind of a placeless institution, whatever it is, and we would often make use of maker spaces or workshops, or like at the university, or maker spaces in the city, or there's a eco village that we did some work at. And it did lead me to reflect on the sort of abundance of tools and spaces and maker spaces for these kinds of projects, and how underutilized they seemed. And so a lot of the people in the kind of the peer-to-peer, P2P theory space were like, yes, like once we have all these maker spaces, we can really like enable distributed production of everything, and people can just make everything on their own. But those, in the places that I've visited, there isn't like that agenda. And I think that's the sort of vision, or the future, at least trajectory, that is missing, like that the projects don't actually fit together. And we've been talking about like, yeah, like wouldn't it be nice if when you went to go learn how to use a 3D printer, you didn't make like a Yoda keychain or something like that, but like made like a little algae farm, or something like. So we're trying to think about ways that like you might scaffold these projects up. I think the other like unfigured out challenge of some of the projects that I was just showing, it was important to me that what we do in the Solarpunk Design Academy is that and I'm sort of borrowing direct reference from some of the Solarpunk manifestos, like infrastructures of resistance is the term that I really hung on to. That the things that we're making are really not the things that we're making. Again, it's sort of like, yeah, we're here to make a hydroponic tower, but the thing that we're making is a system for food production, and also like that whole community of practice that unfolds around it. And so that part, like the maintenance and the sort of like new sites and networks of communication for that stuff to happen, I don't know like how much additional support that would require.
Hi, first of all, thank you again for the awesome presentation. I just wanted to add maybe a corollary to Michael's question, to how you envision maybe this new machine class of designers that artificial intelligence might change either diffuse design or big D design, and also kind of the absence potentially of artifacts as people are designing in virtual environments fully. So what that might look like.
Yeah. I mean, at the risk of being rude, I'd like to say, like, I don't know any more than anybody else, like, God, everybody's got an opinion about AI, and I'm like, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I kind of mean that. Like, I mean, I certainly have thoughts about it, but I don't know that my thoughts are more informed than anybody else's. I mean, I think we will see in a variety of ways, both, a proliferation of like more possibilities that are probably not that different from each other, and I suspect like a whole lot more enshittification. And so someone I've had the good fortune to teach with at the University of Michigan, a guy named Ron Bronson, he's teaching one of the service design courses. He works for an organization called 18F, which is like the digital services organization for the US federal government. And this is sort of his perspective. He's like, think about when you had a not amazing service experience with a human. Okay. Now picture one where you had to deal with some kind of automated system. Now imagine no humans were involved, right? Like how you imagine the escalation of frustration and sort of like, things falling apart inside the service design space of that. So I guess that's one perspective, but I don't want to be just negative, because I do think that there are, when it seems like when used in certain ways, when prompted in certain ways, maybe this is sort of like an idea generation machine of some kind, but how does one sort of carry the thread, sort of the human thread of, what needs are we satisfying when, for example, you're using generative AI to write the email, and I'm using generative AI to write the email. Like, why don't we just talk to each other? Like, why do we burn up, dozens of years of energy for that exchange? I'll say I made the sort of snide comment at the beginning, but in a couple months, having a sort of open conference discussion with some friends who are working in big tech about some of these issues. And I asked a friend of mine who is a UX person at Microsoft, like, can you ever just show up at work and be like, listen, I just don't care about AI anymore? It's like, no, it's not an option.
So I think we'll have time for one or two more questions, but I want to go over what's happening at 11:30 so that everybody knows. We have split events. So in 206, we have Nancy Chang's workshop. Here in 177, we have a wonderful panel with Jeff Ho, Ken Yoakum, Ye Kong, Corey Russell, Famo, and Yi Zhao Yang. And it's about APRU, Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub. And then we also have a wonderful workshop in 166, and you might need a map to get there. But I would highly recommend it because I don't even know what it's about. It's a surprise and it sounds fabulous. Okay, so, and one more thing. We have Matthew's book in the design library. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly suggest you check it out. Okay, time for one more or maybe two. Kari?
Thank you so much. That was really incredible. I guess I was wondering, I think, like, from what I've read about, like, post-capitalist, like, thinking, one of the issues that comes up is sort of this tendency of capitalism to, like, absorb or, like, co-opt these, like, anti-capitalist ideas into just, like, new forms of extractivism. And so I guess I'm curious how you prevent that, or like how that impacts like post-capitalist thinking.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's tied to Michael's question about the internet in many ways, which is like how do you design? Well, yeah, I guess design against that possibility, and I think it's very difficult. I'll start with that. But I also think that I'm going to go back to, I referenced Eric Wallenwright a little bit ago. He was an American sociologist that was a kind of a mentor and a big inspiration in a lot of this work. And he describes, and I sort of have latched onto this theory of change, which is erosion, you know? And so, I mean, to take the example of like Wikipedia, at some point, you know, the more desirable way of satisfying a need is not the one that has been co-opted and commodified, but the other one. And so in circumstances of scarcity, capitalism is very good at sort of like gobbling up and building enclosures and things like that. But in situations where, you know, information and abundance can be found, this theory of erosion can happen. And I think that again, I'm looking at this from the design perspective, but as design projects and practices can start to operate, I think it's like kind of like half in this world and half in the next, it may be possible that that relationship allows the erosion of some of the structures of capture and extraction that have existed. You know, it's that we can look at some case studies and question how they worked, but it's also somewhat, it's a theory of change to be asked about. The conference that's coming up that I mentioned, talking with folks who have similar inclinations, have studied and written on similar topics, but also work in big tech. This is why I think the important conversation that we want to have is about coordination. How is it that you, in a situation with access to, you know, big levers of power and, you know, sort of the network power of these large organizations, can do some things that I cannot do, but then there are things that I can do that you cannot do, and how do we actually sort of coordinate efforts so that we're actually enacting this process of erosion. So I wish I had a more easy answer for you, but I think that this is the kind of logic that is at least behind the theory of change.
Yeah, I feel like none of these answers are easy, but you're doing great. I think we have time for like a very short question maybe before we give everybody a little break between sessions. Does anyone have one final thought that they'd like to share? Okay, maybe you're free from the hot seat. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.